Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name's Jeremy. Please excuse my bandaged face. I've had some skin cancer removed. Problem caused by attachment to wanting to have brown skin when you're a child. The main objective of summer was to get your skin as brown as possible. The topic for tonight is called Don't Believe Everything You Think. And I stole that from a title of a Buddhist book. So I just want to talk a bit about illusion or illusory appearances, false appearances, and wisdom. And this month I've been encouraging you to take a scientific approach to your spiritual practice and studying these topics. So by that I just mean taking cue from the Buddha's statement that he encouraged his students to investigate and test his ideas thoroughly before accepting them. So when you come to a session like this and people present these ideas, then feel free to test them thoroughly before accepting them. And feel free to ask questions. So you're not expected to accept any of these ideas without thoroughly testing them. And I think when you do investigate them, analyse them, and you find that they bear up well under analysis, so that the value of these ideas, I think, is more easy to appreciate when you do examine them thoroughly. Okay, but firstly we'll do some meditation. So we'll do the same meditation that we've been doing for the last 3 weeks. And this is firstly a concentration meditation. So as you probably know, the purpose of concentration meditation is to focus your mind on one neutral object, something that doesn't generate attachment or aversion in your mind. So we're focusing on the breath. And because our mind has the tendency to jump from one mental object to the next, so we need to use mindfulness, which is the mental faculty of remembering the object. So we've decided to focus our mind on the breath, so we're keeping that in mind, remembering that. And then alertness or introspection is observing to see whether the concentration has wandered off onto something else, and then to bring it back. So it's good to understand those two mental faculties of mindfulness and alertness, and then try to employ them, try to use them, develop them, while you're meditating. Geshe Doga, the resident teacher, says those two are his best friends. So he says he's always happy because he has his two best friends, which are mindfulness and introspection. So they keep our mind focused on a positive object, positive or neutral object. Okay, so firstly just sit in a posture which you find comfortable, and also that helps you to remain alert. So we need to be alert and to avoid sleepiness, but not too distracted. So keep our eyes slightly open to let some light in, to avoid sleepiness. So then just bring your attention to your body and observe how your body is feeling. And relax your body. Let go of any tension. And then bring your attention to your breath and observe your breath moving in and out. If you like, you can focus on the tip point just under the tip of your nose on the sensation of the breath moving in and out past that point. So mindfulness is keeping that object in mind, the breath moving in and out. Alertness is checking up to see how the concentration is going. So try to keep your focus on the breath for the duration of 9 breaths. After 9 breaths, check if your concentration has wandered. And again, bring your concentration back to that point. Try to hold it there for 9 breaths. So we don't use a lot of force, just resting your mind on that point, lightly resting it and remaining alert. Then again, check your concentration. If it's wandered, just bring it back to the point, to the breath. Again, place it there for 9 breaths. Now visualize that as you're breathing in, you're breathing in white and golden light. And this light is completely pervading your body and mind, and filling your body and mind with a blissful, enlightened energy. And visualize that as you breathe out, you're breathing out dark light, which represents completely expelling any problems or pain or suffering, any afflictive emotions being completely expelled. So just focus on that visualization for a few minutes. Feel that the light is completely filling every atom in your body and every corner of your mind. And you're expelling even the tiniest problems or discomfort. Then you visualize that you have reached a state that is completely free of all problems and afflictions, all pain, discomfort, and achieved a state that is completely embodiment of the wisdom and compassion of enlightenment, so perfect enlightenment. And then you imagine radiating out from your heart is light, gold and white light, which emanates out and completely fills all other beings, fills them with the same blissful, enlightened energy, completely pervades their body and mind. So try to expand your visualization to include as many beings as possible, humans and animals. And also focus on the people that you don't like, the ones who cause you problems. So also with this visualization, we're using mindfulness and alertness. So mindfulness is keeping the mind focused on the visualization. Alertness is checking to see if the mind is wandering off. Then at the end of the meditation, you visualize that the light withdraws back into your heart, dissolves back into your heart. And you visualize that all other beings have attained a state of free of problems and suffering, in which all their problems have been removed and they've achieved the enlightened qualities of wisdom and compassion. Just end the meditation there. So any questions or comments about that meditation? Once when we were doing that, one guy asked, he was a bit concerned about the black light coming out and whether it was like polluting the environment. So what do I do with the black light? I was thinking maybe you could just turn it into fertilizer or something useful. So that kind of encapsulates, I guess, the Buddhist path to enlightenment. The idea is to remove your own afflictions and develop your own positive qualities so that you're able to, in a best position to benefit, to help other beings. So that's kind of the idea. And you can see how that's familiarizing your mind with the practice of compassion, just thinking about others and their welfare. So it's quite simple, and it's, as I said, the word meditation just means familiarization. So you're familiarizing your mind, in that case, with the idea of compassion. And so becoming used to that way of thinking. I think that can be, when you find yourself being very caught up in your own problems and you're getting very stressed, that kind of visualization can help you just to focus your mind out onto others and take yourself out of your own particular set of problems. Mm-hmm. Anyway, feel free to try that whenever you feel like it. So just to recap a little bit where we've gotten to with our discussion this month. Doesn't matter whether you've been here each week or not. So we started off by considering the idea that, or the question of whether external objects, or where does happiness come from? So we're examining happiness and the causes of happiness in a scientific way. So firstly, considering where does happiness come from? And so then we're talking about whether happiness comes from things inside the mind or outside the mind. And then if you look at things outside the mind, like physical objects and people and sense experiences, etc. So the idea is that these things do not guarantee happiness because they are outside the mind. So that was the first idea we were talking about in the first week, and the reasons to establish that. And so I asked you to investigate that. Maybe you had some interesting insights into that, whether you agree with that idea that because something is external to the mind, it can't be a true or definite cause of happiness because it's external. Because happiness is a mental phenomena, and therefore its primary cause must be mental. That's one of the Buddhist ideas. So I'm encouraging you to check up and see whether you agree with that, whether that rings true. So then if you accept that proposition that these external things can't bring you true, reliable happiness that lasts, so then we need to look within the mind. And if we investigate the mind, then we see that there's so many different ideas and thoughts and emotions going on in the mind. So we need to sort out which of those are helpful and which are not. As one Buddhist teacher says, like sorting, when you go to buy mangoes, you need to have a good way of sorting out which are the good ones and which are the bad. So the process of introspection is to look at what's going on in the mind and identify what the thoughts are and which are helpful and which are unhelpful. So we were talking about attachment and aversion being a good place to start. So a lot of the problems that we experience we can trace back to these attitudes of attachment and aversion. And so what I mean by attachment and aversion there is, attachment is the mind that's exaggerating the good qualities of something and wanting to hold on to that or to consume it or to possess it. And because it's projecting or exaggerating these good qualities, then it's sort of out of touch with reality. And the same with negative things. So when you dislike someone, the idea is that you're actually projecting something onto them. You're exaggerating their bad qualities or their negative aspects. You're forgetting all the other aspects of them. And so one proof of that is that there will be other people who really like them. So if they were inherently bad, as you see them in that moment, then other people wouldn't see them as good. And they wouldn't be able to change. So if they had that inherent badness, then they wouldn't be able to change into someone nice. And the next day you might see them in a very different way. So it gives you a hint, I think, about how we project these qualities onto people and objects, and then they appear to be coming from the side of the person or the object, but actually they're being projected by our mind. So again, something to investigate. You don't have to agree with that. Please don't agree, just to check it and see whether you think that makes sense, whether that's true. So then if we accept that attachment and aversion are giving rise to problems like anger, aversion gives rise to anger, attachment gives rise to like craving and grasping, and then also lots of other problems like jealousy arise from attachment, And the depression and anxiety can arise from attachment, because if you're very attached to something, then you're naturally fearful of losing that thing, so that causes anxiety. So whether that's a person or a position or losing people's respect, so we can be attached to almost anything. And so the stronger the attachment, then the stronger the anxiety about losing that thing. So I think when we investigate, we find that these minds of attachment and aversion give rise to many problems. And it's useful to start with, say, the thing you regarded as your biggest problem, and then work with that, investigate that. I think when I first became interested in Buddhism, probably depression, I think maybe was the thing that was bothering me the most. So I found that sort of started with that, and you look at what's causing that, and then also anger. You look at anger, why is anger arising, what are the causes of it? So the advice is to start with the thing that's bothering you the most and work from there. If there's nothing bothering you, then that's good. Okay, so attachment and aversion. And then last week we were talking about how attachment and aversion arise from this self-centered mind. So what we mean by that is this kind of attitude which is exaggerating or overly focused on the self, on I, me. And then because we have strong focus on me and I, and forgetting about people around us, and then if you have stronger focus on I, then naturally you have strong focus on what is good for I and what is bad for I. So you're trying to pull all the good things in for the self and trying to push away the bad things, things which seem to be hostile, unhelpful, unfriendly. So you can see how that sets up this kind of conflict where you're trying to control your world and pull all the good things in and push all the bad things out. So it's kind of a constant state of mental, what do you call it? Turmoil, or maybe that's too strong. So, yeah, can you see that connection? Maybe I could ask you that question. Can you see how attachment and aversion arise? If you have a strong sense of I and you're strongly focused on the self, that would give rise to being strongly attached to things that appear good and having strong aversion to things that appear bad or unhelpful to the self. Does that make sense? Anyone disagree with that? So I'm just trying to describe this sort of connection between these various, I guess we call them attitudes, mistaken attitudes maybe, and how they sort of support each other, and we can sort of begin to dismantle them. So you begin to firstly identify how attachment and aversion are causing problems, and then you can see how they're arising from a strong sense of I. And then the practice for overcoming strong sense of I is to focus on love and compassion. So you're focusing on other people, and so you're sort of diminishing the importance of I. So I think you can see how that works. By focusing on others, you're immediately not focusing on this person. So it immediately expands your focus to include, to be much more, like increases the scope of your focus. So sometimes when I'm talking about these things, I feel like you might be thinking, well, that's kind of all very well to say to give up, selfishness. But it's not. It's much easier to say than to do. It sounds a bit like giving up being a human. But the idea here is not to sort of get overwhelmed by the kind of enormity of that challenge, is to overcome selfishness and attachment, but just to see how, firstly, just recognize how those things cause cause problems, and how the problems that we're experiencing can relate back to those things. So firstly, to identify that. That's the first thing. So seeing the problems that they're causing. And then to identify what the antidote or what the opposite of those things are. For example, strong self-centeredness, so we can practice love and compassion and see how that can reduce the selfish concern and increase our concern for others. And it's a gradual thing, and the more we can diminish this selfishness, then the less problems we have. So I think we start to see that kind of cause and effect relationship. The less attachment we have, then the less disturbance we have in our mind, the more peace we have in our mind. And if you have less attachment, then you have less aversion. So then you can see how your mind sort of stops this kind of roller coaster of emotions going up and down, reacting to attachment with attachment and aversion to things around you all the time. So your mind starts to become more peaceful, I think. So it's a gradual process, and the extent to which you're able to do that is the extent to which you will feel the benefits, I would say. Yep. Okay. So then the next question you might ask is, why does this self-cherishing or selfish, self-centered attitude arise? Why does that happen? And so then that sort of brings us to the Buddhist discussion about what you might call ultimate truth, or the way things exist. And Buddhism has a lot to say on this topic, and it's a fascinating topic. And the idea here is that a lot of what appears to our mind is illusory. And so what I mean by that is that when we talk about ignorance in this context, we're not talking about just not knowing something, as in like not knowing how to speak Italian, for example, or not knowing pi. We're talking about an active ignorance, which is projecting a false view, projecting something that appears to be real, which is not, or projecting something which, an appearance of things existing in a way which is different to how they actually exist. So there's a discrepancy between how they appear and how they actually exist. So then the challenge is to find out what that discrepancy is, how the appearance is differing from the reality. And that's the purpose of this investigation. In fact, there's I think you could say that the whole spiritual practice is aimed at overcoming that in the end. What we're trying to overcome is these mistaken appearances, because they lie at the heart of all of these other afflictive emotions that arise, like self-centeredness. So some examples of these kind of false appearances. So a good example is attachment that we were talking about. So when you're strongly attached to something, that object can seem completely, perfectly beautiful. And the beauty that's appearing to your mind appears to be coming from the object, not from your mind. We know the adage that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but when we see something that's so beautiful, we don't feel like it's being projected by our mind onto that object. That's not how it appears. So we need to investigate. So we have this strong appearance of this thing being inherently beautiful from its own side. So then we investigate, is that beauty actually there in the object, or is it coming from projected by our mind? So one clue is, as I was saying, if that object was inherently beautiful, then everybody would see it as beautiful, as perfectly beautiful in the way that you are, whether it's a person or a thing or... But that's not the case. So not everyone sees that object as perfectly beautiful. So does that mean that they're wrong and you're right? Or does that mean that it's being projected by your mind? And then if you observe that object over time, then you notice that it changes, perhaps from day to day, whether it's a person or object. Some days it looks more beautiful than others. Eventually it might not appear beautiful at all. So through these investigations, we can see how these kind of appearances are projected by the mind. And it's kind of amazing that your mind can project so perfectly those kind of that kind of beauty onto something, and appears so completely convincingly to be coming from the sight of the object. But when we investigate, we can't find that beauty anywhere in the object. So if it's yeah. So any thoughts on that? Do you agree with that? In relation to attachment, can you see how your mind projects beauty onto things?
Can you argue that
Yeah.
the reality is that, is projection, is perception, and it's constantly changing? And you argue that, 10 people look at one thing and have different thoughts and feelings and opinions, and they're all correct.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So maybe everyone is correct. But the point here is that when you look at that thing, the beauty seems to be coming from the object, doesn't it? Does it? Like when you see something, imagine something really beautiful, and the beauty seems to be somehow contained in that object. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that when you investigate, that's not the case. The beauty is not in the object. And if there were 10 people looking at the same thing and they were having different reactions, then the question would be, how could it be 10 different things in one? If it was existing in the way that it appeared, is what I'm saying, it couldn't be 10 different things. Because that's not how it's appearing to you. Do you agree?
Yeah, that's why I thought the answer might be that everyone's right, so your perception is the reality, and everyone has their own reality.
Yeah. So I think the Buddhist view would probably be what you're saying, is that these are just projections by the minds of the people who are looking at that object.
So who says and who defines what is reality? What is that object? What is the true state of that object?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there was a funny anecdote about, I think there were some spirits discussing which of their wives were the most beautiful, and they went to ask a monk and asked him what he thought, and he said, well, whichever one appears most beautiful is the most beautiful. So that's the idea, is that beauty is actually just an appearance. It doesn't exist anywhere else other than as an appearance to the mind. It can't be found anywhere else. Can it? Yes, go on.
Would you just not argue that that's your definition of beauty? Like, what's the subjective experience?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So what is beauty? Then I think you'd probably have to say beauty is whatever appears beautiful to you, isn't it? I mean, you couldn't really give any other definition, could you? So everyone has a different idea of what's beautiful. So then, I guess, if the beauty existed in the way that it appears, then it should be findable. That's one argument. So if, for example, you see a person, you think they're very beautiful, then if that beauty was existing within that person, then when you investigate closely, you should be able to find it there somehow. But if you investigate all the molecules of the person, all the parts of the person, you can't find. The more you look, it just disappears, the beauty. You look anatomically at that person or within their mind, there's just all these parts. So you can't find the beauty in the object anywhere. Yes?
I'm sort of interested about how this relates to concepts in other systems of philosophy and religion about the beauty and inherent worth of people and of relationships, because really what I hear you saying is the best thing you can be is unattached to things except for way of thinking, there's nothing more beautiful than the love, say, that a parent has for a small child.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So yeah, so we're not kind of aiming at this sort of kind of bland equanimity where nothing is beautiful and nothing is ugly. So we're not saying that beauty doesn't exist. We're just saying that beauty is an appearance to the mind, and it can't be found in the object. So that's the point. So there's nothing wrong with having beautiful things. There's nothing wrong with being beautiful, and it's just that we need to understand what beauty is. That's the point of this investigation. And so, yeah, so we enjoy beauty in our lives, and for example, our children, or walk in the forest, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we need to understand that beauty is just an appearance to the mind. It can't be found. At least that's the point of this investigation.
There's some things of beauty that really can, like for a child.
Mm.
The beauty of someone who's dressed really nicely is superficially influenced by things we've seen and experienced through marketing and advertising.
Mm.
There are some things which really make.
Yeah, I think we need to also make a distinction between when this kind of attachment is becoming a problem and when it's not. So if your mind is overly attached to something to the point of obsession, you can see how that destroys your happiness. The analogy is like the moth being drawn to the flame. And so I guess an example would be maybe addiction to an unhealthy relationship, for example. The relationship with that person could actually be destroying your life, but because you're so attached to them, you can't give it up. Or attachment to a substance, maybe. So you can see how that kind of attachment can be extremely afflictive and to the point of destroying a person's life. So that's an extreme example. So what we're trying to identify here is when that sort of attachment becomes unhelpful, and when it becomes afflictive, and when it gives rise to problems, that we can use this kind of analysis to see how that thing that the mind is so desperately attached to is just a projection of the mind. And by understanding that, I think we can pacify that strong attachment. So some people say, well, I enjoy attachment, I don't want to give it up. So that's also okay. But I think we need to clearly understand what attachment is here. So attachment is an affliction in this context, and it's actually said to be the opposite of happiness. It's actually stopping you from enjoying that thing, that person, or that delicious food or whatever. So there's a difference between the enjoyment and the attachment. So attachment is something which is disturbing your mind. So we need to be clear about that. Again, something we investigate through our meditation, I think. Is attachment disturbing my mind, or is it pleasurable? So, that's a good example of, I think, of a false appearance. So that strong beauty which is appearing to come from the side of the object, which is actually projected by your mind. So then other examples of this kind of appearance. Another one which we were talking about last week was this feeling that this I is, or looking after this I or self is the most important thing in my world. And so as the Dalai Lama often makes the comment that looking after the self first is actually irrational. So why is it irrational? Because it's causing a lot of problems for the self. So he's saying, if you could let go of this kind of obsession with the self and focus more on others, kind of relax this self-cherishing and focus more on others, then you immediately would feel happier, because all of the problems which arise from the preoccupation with the self would start to be subdued. So he's saying there's no rational reason why you should look after this self more than others. So that's a very challenging idea, I think. Something, again, we need to investigate. He also says this also because the self is just one and others are many. So again, it's irrational to look after the one. But then we feel like, well, someone's got to look after this self. It should be me. It's my responsibility. So isn't it irresponsible to forget about this self and focus on others? So his challenge is to say, well, just try it. Try looking after all others and forget about the self and see how it goes. And he's saying the self will be taken care of. You don't need to worry about the self. If your mind is focused on love and compassion for all others, then this self will actually be much better off and will be fine. Anyway, so that's something to check out. Okay. So then other examples of false appearances. So an interesting idea which is a theme in Buddhism is the idea of permanence and impermanence. So we tend to adhere to a view of things being permanent. So when I'm talking about permanence here, what I'm talking about is not saying that things last forever, but saying that things have an unchanging essence. So, for example, if you have a strong attachment to a person, then you're projecting an unchanging essence on them. Again, you don't have to agree with me, but what this idea is that we falsely project an unchanging essence onto that person, and also onto ourself. So, an example I was thinking of. So, remember once I talked about this idea, and someone put up their hand indignantly and said, "I don't think of myself as unchanging." So obviously we can see that we do change. From beginning, from our childhood to our adulthood, we've changed enormously, and we change from day to day. We can see that we're constantly changing, but this idea is that underneath that we have an appearance of this sort of unchanging essence, like an unchanging I that's continuing unchangingly from moment to moment. I think an example maybe is sometimes, I'm not sure if you experienced it, but you think of something you did maybe decades ago that was really embarrassing or unkind or something, and just sort of overwhelmed by this kind of regret. Oh my God. Happens to me quite often. In fact, I was walking down the street one day and this thought popped into my head, and I think I actually slapped my forehead, like that, and this woman was walking past and she kind of smiled at me. I think maybe she could see what had happened. Maybe she was recognising that feeling. Anyway, that's partly arising from not keeping your mind in the present moment. If you keep your mind in the present moment, then you wouldn't have those kind of bad memories coming up. But anyway, I think that's a good illustration of how we have this feeling of this person with some kind of unchanging essence. That the person who did that 2 or 3 decades ago is the same person now. We have that feeling, and so that is also said to be a false appearance, which is causing problems. So because we have that kind of appearance, and also it comes up in relation to attachment, because you see this person or this object that you're attached to as having this kind of unchanging essence, this kind of permanent essence, then the attachment arises in dependence upon that false view. But then if you investigate that person or that object, you can't find any unchanging essence or anything that's permanent within them. So if you investigate, for example, the body, their body or your body, there's nothing in the body which is staying unchanging even for a moment. So biologists have found that the cells are replaced every 7 to 15 years, I think it is. So that it's constantly changing the body. And then the mind is also in a constant state of change. I think you would agree. You don't have to. But so you can't find anything, when you investigate the person, you can't find any unchanging essence there. Yes?
How does that relate to the idea of reincarnation, which to me implies it is some sort of spiritual
Yes, good question.
Life, death,
Yeah. So as you no doubt know, the Buddhist view is that the mind continues from life to life. So then the question arises, what is it that's being reincarnated? So it's not the body, obviously, so we leave the body behind. And then is it, if there's no unchanging essence, then how can we say that that person is continuing? So what it comes down to is this sort of extremely subtle, the person actually is something extremely subtle in the Buddhist view. It's actually just a label, is the way it's explained. So we label I onto this collection of body and mind, and it's that sort of label of I which is continuing on into the... So it's said to be extremely subtle. But in the same way, everything else is equally subtle. So it's not that the self is more subtle than other things. Yeah, that's... I'm not sure if that's a helpful answer. But it's interesting to investigate that idea. Firstly, ask yourself: do you have that feeling of there being an unchanging I here, an unchanging essence? And do you have that feeling about other people and other objects? Maybe we can do some meditation on that. All right, just for a couple of minutes, we'll do that meditation on impermanence. So just think of, think of yourself. So you're here in your body, and firstly try to identify whether you have that feeling that there is some kind of unchanging essence or unchanging person there. And then try to investigate whether an unchanging person or essence can be found. So you firstly look within the body, so all the parts of the body, the limbs, the trunk, your head. So all the parts of the body are made up of other parts, so the skeleton and the muscles and the circulatory system and all the organs, and they're all constantly moving. So there's nothing within the body you could say is staying still for even a moment, I don't think. So even all the parts are made up of molecules, and they're made up of atoms. So the parts of the atoms are all in constant motion. So we can't find anything which is unchanging within the body. And then you look at the mind and investigate whether there's anything in the mind that is unchanging. So you think of all the thoughts that come and go through your mind, the emotions that arise and fade away. So even the long-lasting thoughts. So you might have a relationship with someone that's long-lasting and you have a strong feeling towards them. So investigate whether that is unchanging. We can see that even that feeling changes from day to day. It fluctuates. It doesn't always remain the same. So can you find anything in the mind that is unchanging? And then you can apply the same analysis to the people around you in this room or in your life. And then also all the objects, the physical objects, they're also all in a constant state of change. So the conclusion of this simple meditation is just to see that things are not permanent, they're not unchanging, and they're in a constant state of flux. And so we do this to overcome the false appearance of things being permanent and unchanging. Okay. Some people have said they find that meditation a little bit frightening, that there's nothing that's unchanging. Everything around us is constantly moving. But the idea is that you're familiarizing our mind with the way things are. Now, if you accept that that is how things are, then the idea is to familiarize your mind with that. And also to see how grasping at things as being unchanging, for example, people, is causing us problems. So if we get attached to someone being a certain way, then we may get upset when they change. So the idea is to align our mind, to make our minds realistic about the way things exist. Yep. And then there's further analysis that we can do on a more subtle level, but we won't go into that tonight. But another investigation is that things also appear as partless. So, for example, when we're attached to an object, we sometimes forget that it's comprised of parts. So we're seeing it as some kind of monolithic thing. So by meditating on how that thing is made up of parts, it can break down that false appearance of things being partless. Yep. And also things being independent. So we tend to think of, for example, we think of apple. You think of apple as just arising independently. We forget about all the causes and conditions which led for that apple to be there. And so it's by understanding how things are just like a long sequence of causes and conditions which have led up to this thing called apple, that it's actually just the latest moment in a long line of causes and conditions. And the person is the same. So this thing that we call person is actually just a series of cause and effect relationships which have led to this thing called me or you. So this is also analytical tools to overcome these false appearances of things being independent when they're actually dependent arising. Anyway, they're quite big topics that require more investigation, but just to introduce them to you. Okay, so that's probably enough for tonight. I just wanted to introduce that idea of don't believe everything you think, and to, when you're having these kind of afflictive emotions, to try and investigate how they arise based on false conceptions, for example, attachment. And to use those sort of analytical tools to investigate how the false appearances are arising, or what false appearances are arising. So just to give you some idea of that. And also not to be too concerned about them. You know, you realize that your mind is having these kind of false appearances. It's not to worry about it too much, it's just to observe it and then investigate it. Not to sort of panic and think, oh, that's terrible. But it's just something that's arising in your mind, and to understand it is the idea, firstly. By understanding it, then it's much easier to sort of subdue it, not take it too seriously. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and good luck with your meditation practice. And please stay for tea and cake if you want to.